On the afternoon of April 16th, 1992, at approximately 2:35 p.m., a 70-year-old man in a gray overcoat and worn leather shoes walked through the entrance of the British Embassy in Riga, Latvia, and informed the receptionist in halting English that he had information of significant intelligence value to share with British authorities. His name was Vasili Mitrokhin. He was a retired senior archivist from the First Chief Directorate of the Committee for State Security of the Soviet Union, the KGB. In his briefcase, he carried sample notes, and in 6 large trunks stored at a dacha outside Moscow, he had handwritten documentation covering approximately 300,000 top-secret KGB files spanning 5 decades of Soviet intelligence operations across every continent. What he was about to deliver would constitute the most complete intelligence archive ever received from a single source in the history of Cold War espionage. Vasili Mitrokhin had been born on March 3, 1922, in the village of Yurasovo in the Ryazan Oblast, approximately 120 miles southeast of Moscow. His father, Nikita Mitrokhin, had worked as a rural laborer. His mother, Yevdokia, had raised Vasily and his 3 siblings in circumstances of considerable hardship that were typical of Soviet rural life in the 1920s and early 1930s. According to biographical records compiled later by British intelligence, Vasily had been an academically capable student who showed particular aptitude for languages and meticulous record-keeping, traits that would define his professional life and his eventual defection. In 1948, at the age of 26, Mitrokhin had joined the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Service, initially working in operations targeting Western Europe. His early career had been unremarkable in the context of Soviet intelligence work. He had served competently in various administrative and operational support roles without distinguishing himself as particularly ambitious or ideologically zealous. In 1956, Mitrokhin had been assigned to KGB operations in Austria, where he spent approximately 2 years handling administrative coordination for case officers working to recruit Austrian and Western European assets. It was during this assignment, according to his later debriefings with British intelligence, that Mitrokhin first began to experience doubts about the Soviet system and the nature of the work he was supporting. The specific incident that triggered these doubts involved a KGB operation to compromise an Austrian journalist who had been critical of Soviet policies. Mitrokhin had been responsible for maintaining the operational files on this case. The operation had involved blackmail based on fabricated evidence of sexual misconduct, threats against the journalist's family members still living in territory controlled by the Soviet Union, and ultimately a recruitment under coercion that Mitrokhin found morally troubling. According to his testimony, what disturbed him most was not the operation itself. Such methods were routine in intelligence work, but rather the casual cruelty with which his colleagues discussed the journalist's distress and the pleasure some of them seemed to take in his suffering. This disillusionment had deepened in 1968 when Soviet forces invaded Czechoslovakia to suppress the Prague Spring Reform movement. Mitrokhin, like many Soviet citizens, had followed the developments in Czechoslovakia with interest and had been cautiously hopeful that the reforms might represent a genuine liberalization of communist governance. The military intervention and the subsequent crackdown on Czech reformers had struck him as a betrayal of the ideals he had believed the Soviet Union represented. According to his debriefing accounts, he had begun during this period to see the Soviet system not as imperfect but correctable, but as fundamentally oppressive and morally bankrupt. However, Mitrokhin had not defected in 1968, nor in the years immediately following. He had a wife, whom he had married in 1950, and 2 children, a son born in 1952 and a daughter born in 1955. Defection would have meant abandoning his family, as the Soviet authorities would never have permitted them to leave with him, and would likely have subjected them to severe punishment as relatives of a traitor. Mitrokhin had concluded that he could not justify imposing such consequences on his wife and children regardless of his own ideological disillusionment. In 1972, at the age of 50, Mitrokhin had been transferred to a new assignment that would transform his relationship with Soviet intelligence and create the opportunity for what he would eventually undertake. He was appointed to a senior position in the Archives Department of the KGB's First Chief Directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence operations. The First Chief Directorate was moving its archive from the Lubyanka building in central Moscow to a new facility in Yasenevo, a southwestern suburb of the city. Mitrokhin's specific responsibility was to oversee the physical transfer of hundreds of thousands of files, to organize them in the new archive facility, and to establish cataloging systems that would allow KGB officers to efficiently locate and retrieve documents. The archive that Mitrokhin was now responsible for contained the operational records of Soviet foreign intelligence from the 1920s through the present day. The files documented recruitment operations, lists of agents and assets operating undercover in dozens of countries, details of intelligence collected from human sources and technical operations, assessments of foreign political figures and institutions, plans for influence operations and active measures, and comprehensive records of KGB activities across every region where the Soviet Union had intelligence interests. The transfer of the archive from Lubyanka to Yasenevo took place over a period of approximately 2 years, from 1972 to 1974. During this time, Mitrokhin had access to files that few people in the entire Soviet intelligence apparatus had ever seen in such breadth. Most KGB officers worked on specific operations or geographic regions and had access only to files relevant to their assignments. Mitrokhin, by virtue of his position, was responsible for handling and organizing everything. Before we continue with how Mitrokhin executed one of the most audacious intelligence operations in Cold War history, if you're interested in the documented truth behind these forgotten espionage cases, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We publish new investigations every week, uncovering the real human cost behind Cold War operations. Now, let's examine exactly how a single archivist managed to document 300,000 secret files without detection. According to his later testimony, it was during the early months of the archive transfer that Mitrokhin conceived the idea of creating a comprehensive record of what the files contained. His initial motivation, as he described it, was partly historical, a sense that these documents represented important historical evidence that should somehow be preserved, and partly a form of resistance. He believed the Soviet system was unjust, and that its intelligence operations, which he was helping to organize and maintain, served to perpetuate that injustice. Creating a record of these operations felt to him like a way of bearing witness and potentially enabling future accountability. The practical challenge was immense. The files could not be removed from the archive facility. Security protocols required that all materials remain within the building, with access logs maintained for every file retrieved and returned. Mitrokhin could not photograph the files, as cameras were prohibited in the archive areas and the use of photographic equipment would have been immediately noticed and reported. Photocopying was similarly impossible, as copy machines were strictly controlled and all copies were logged. What Mitrokhin could do, and what would not raise suspicion given his position, was to read the files extensively as part of his cataloging work, and to take notes. KGB archivists routinely took notes on file contents to create catalog entries and finding aids. Mitrokhin began taking extraordinarily detailed notes, not brief catalog descriptions, but comprehensive summaries that captured the essential content of the documents he was reviewing. His method was meticulous and time-consuming. He would read a file carefully, often multiple times, to ensure he understood its contents fully. He would then write detailed notes by hand on small sheets of paper, using a combination of Russian and abbreviated notation he developed to maximize the information he could record in limited space. The notes captured operational details with precision, agent identities and code names, recruitment circumstances, intelligence provided, operational timelines, and descriptions of active measures and influence campaigns. The KGB's failure to detect Mitrokhin's activities for 12 years reflected systemic weaknesses in Soviet security culture. Senior archivists like Mitrokhin were considered trusted insiders who had already undergone extensive vetting and political reliability assessments. The sheer volume of files being transferred, hundreds of thousands of documents, made comprehensive monitoring of every archivist's activities impossible. Security officials assumed that access controls at the building perimeter were sufficient, and that no one with Mitrokhin's seniority, decades of service, and unblemished record would contemplate such betrayal. Senior personnel were subject to less scrutiny than junior staff, operating under a presumption of loyalty that Mitrokhin systematically exploited. That assumption would prove catastrophic. Mitrokhin worked on this project systematically from 1972 until his retirement from the KGB in 1984. He focused particularly on files that documented the most significant operations or that revealed patterns of Soviet intelligence activity that would be valuable for understanding the scope and nature of KGB work. He took notes on operations in Western Europe, North America, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. He documented recruitment of government officials, journalists, academics, business leaders, and others who had provided information or influence to the KGB. His method, established during the first months of the transfer, never varied over the 12 years that followed. Each day that Mitrokhin worked in the archive, he would add new notes to his collection. He developed a routine of concealing the notes on his person when leaving the archive building at the end of each workday, typically folded into small packets and hidden in his shoes, in the lining of his jacket, or in other locations where they would not be discovered during the routine security checks that all KGB employees underwent when entering and exiting secure facilities. Once he had successfully removed the notes from the archive building, Mitrokhin faced the challenge of storing them securely at home. He lived with his wife and, during the early years of the project, his children in a modest apartment in Moscow. Keeping large quantities of handwritten notes about KGB operations in his apartment would have been extraordinarily dangerous if discovered. The Soviet system encouraged neighbors to report suspicious activities, and KGB officers themselves were subject to periodic security reviews that could include searches of their residences. Mitrokhin solved this problem by storing the notes in a location outside his apartment where they would be less likely to be discovered. He and his wife owned a small dacha, a rural vacation cottage located outside Moscow. The dacha, like millions of others owned by Soviet citizens, was a simple wooden structure used primarily during summer months for gardening and recreation. Mitrokhin began transferring his notes to the dacha, where he hid them beneath the floorboards in a storage area that would not normally be accessed. As the volume of notes grew, Mitrokhin became more sophisticated in his storage methods. He acquired several large trunks, the kind commonly used by Soviet citizens for storing household items and clothing. By his own later estimate, his notes had grown to fill 6 large trunks, organized by geographic region and operational category. Some were hidden in the attic space under the roof. Others were buried in the garden or concealed in a small outbuilding used for storing tools and firewood. During these 12 years, from 1972 to 1984, Mitrokhin maintained his double existence with remarkable self-control. At work, he was a loyal and competent KGB archivist, respected by colleagues for his thoroughness and his extensive knowledge of the archive's contents. At home, he was an apparently conventional Soviet citizen, a husband, father, and grandfather, who gardened at his dacha, spent time with his family, and gave no outward indication of any subversive activities or ideological disloyalty. His wife, according to his later testimony, had no knowledge of what he was doing. He had concluded early in the project that informing her would serve no purpose except to place her at risk and burden her with knowledge that could endanger both of them. If his activities were discovered, her genuine ignorance might provide some protection. If she knew and was interrogated, her knowledge could be used against both of them. The psychological burden of maintaining this secret for 12 years, while continuing to work in the very institution whose operations he was documenting, was considerable. Mitrokhin described in his debriefings experiencing chronic anxiety about discovery, particularly during periods when security protocols at the archive were tightened, or when he learned of investigations into other KGB personnel suspected of disloyalty. He developed elaborate protocols for his note-taking and removal activities to minimize risk, never taking too many notes on a single day, varying his patterns to avoid establishing routines that might be noticed, and maintaining rigid operational security about never discussing his activities or hinting at his intentions to anyone. In 1984, at the age of 62, Mitrokhin retired from the KGB. His retirement was routine and unremarkable. He had reached the standard retirement age, had served with apparent loyalty for more than 3 decades, and received the standard pension and recognition for long service. Colleagues who attended his retirement gathering would later report, when questioned by Russian security services after his defection became known, that he had seemed content and had expressed no unusual sentiments or concerns. Retirement brought both relief and new challenges. Mitrokhin no longer had to maintain the daily deception of working in the archive while secretly documenting it. However, he now faced the question of what to do with the enormous collection of notes he had accumulated. They remained hidden at his dacha, representing an extraordinary intelligence resource, but also an enormous personal risk. If discovered by Soviet authorities, the notes would constitute overwhelming evidence of espionage, punishable by execution. Mitrokhin spent the next several years considering his options. The Soviet Union in the mid-1980s was beginning to experience the changes associated with Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika. There were hints of liberalization, though the KGB and the broader security apparatus remained powerful and vigilant. Mitrokhin considered whether the reforms might eventually create conditions where he could reveal the notes within the Soviet system, perhaps as part of a process of historical accountability or reform of the intelligence services. However, he concluded that this was unrealistic. The KGB had too much invested in protecting its operations and its officers. The notes documented activities that would embarrass the Soviet government, expose ongoing operations, and compromise agents who were still active. By 1990, as the Soviet Union began its final descent toward collapse, Mitrokhin decided that he would attempt to defect and offer his archive to a Western intelligence service. He was 68 years old in declining health, increasingly concerned that he might die before accomplishing anything with the work of 12 years, and aware that the political changes underway created both opportunities and dangers. The dissolution of the Soviet system might create windows of opportunity for defection, but it might also lead to chaos in which the notes could be lost or destroyed. Mitrokhin's first attempt to make contact with Western intelligence was with the United States. In March 1992, several weeks after arriving in the newly independent Baltic state of Latvia, he approached the CIA station in Riga. He requested a meeting with an intelligence officer and indicated that he had important information to share about KGB operations spanning decades. The response from American officials was dismissive. According to later accounts from CIA officials who reviewed the case, the officer who met with Mitrokhin in Riga assessed him as a probable fabricator or Russian intelligence plant. The officer's report noted that the claims seemed implausibly grandiose. An elderly walk-in volunteer claiming to possess comprehensive documentation of 300,000 KGB files. Mitrokhin had not brought any of his notes to this initial meeting, concerned about the risk of carrying such materials into the American facility, and without physical evidence to demonstrate the credibility of his offer, the CIA officer could not take his claims seriously. The decision not to pursue contact was made within 48 hours of the initial approach. It would later be described by the CIA's own internal review as one of the most significant intelligence failures in American history, the rejection of what would become the most complete intelligence archive ever obtained from a Soviet source. The Cold War had officially ended. The Soviet Union no longer existed. American intelligence agencies were being pressured to reduce their focus on Russian operations and to redirect resources toward other priorities. Walk-in volunteers offering intelligence were common in the chaotic post-Soviet period, and the vast majority were either fantasists, con artists, or provocateurs sent by Russian intelligence to test American responsiveness or to plant disinformation. The Americans told Mitrokhin that they appreciated his approach, but that they could not pursue the matter without concrete evidence of what he claimed to possess. They suggested that if he wanted to provide samples of the documents, they would review them and reconsider. Mitrokhin left the meeting frustrated and uncertain how to proceed. His rejection by the Americans led him to approach British intelligence instead. He had reasons to believe the British might be more receptive. MI6, the British Foreign Intelligence Service, had a long history of successful defector operations and was known within intelligence circles for taking walk-in volunteers seriously and conducting thorough evaluations of their claims. On April 16, 1992, Mitrokhin walked into the British Embassy in Riga and made his approach. Unlike the Americans, the British intelligence officer who met with him, whose identity has never been publicly disclosed, immediately recognized the potential significance and conducted a detailed preliminary debriefing. Mitrokhin described the scope of his notes, explained his position in the KGB Archive, outlined the time period covered, and provided enough specific examples of operational details to demonstrate credibility. The officer concluded that if Mitrokhin was telling the truth, the intelligence value would be immense. Even if he was exaggerating or misrepresenting the extent of his archive, the risk of not investigating further was too great. The British arranged for Mitrokhin to be brought to London for more extensive debriefings. In late April 1992, using a cover story about medical treatment, Mitrokhin traveled to the United Kingdom. Over the next several weeks, MI6 officers conducted detailed interrogations to assess his credibility, his knowledge, and the nature of what he claimed to possess. The debriefings quickly confirmed that Mitrokhin had genuine access to KGB archival materials and possessed detailed knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations spanning decades. He could describe operations with specificity that would have been impossible for someone fabricating or exaggerating. He knew operational code names, agent identities, recruitment details, and operational timelines that matched information the British had obtained from other sources or that could be verified through independent research. However, Mitrokhin still had not provided the physical archive. The notes remained hidden at his dacha outside Moscow. British intelligence faced a logistical challenge: how to extract 6 large trunks full of handwritten notes from Russia without alerting Russian security services, who would certainly be watching for exactly this kind of intelligence exfiltration in the chaotic post-Soviet period. The operation to retrieve the archive was planned with extraordinary care. According to accounts published years later by British officials and by Mitrokhin's authorized biographer, MI6 arranged for Mitrokhin to return to Moscow in late spring 1992, ostensibly ending his medical treatment in the UK. Over the following months, he would retrieve the trunks from his dacha and prepare them for exfiltration. The exfiltration operation began in late 1992 and continued into early 1993. MI6 officers, operating under diplomatic cover in Moscow, arranged for Mitrokhin to make multiple trips to transfer the trunks from his dacha to secure locations where they could be prepared for transport. The specific details of the exfiltration have never been fully disclosed, but accounts suggest that the trunks were moved by vehicle in stages to avoid attracting attention, then transported out of Russia through diplomatic channels. British diplomatic shipments enjoyed certain legal protections that Russian authorities could not violate without creating an international incident. By March 1993, all 6 trunks had arrived safely in London. When MI6 archivists first opened the trunks at a secure facility outside London, they found themselves looking at what one officer later described as the intelligence equivalent of discovering the Library of Alexandria. The notes were meticulously detailed, carefully organized by subject matter and geographic region, written in Mitrokhin's precise Cyrillic script across thousands of pages. What they contained exceeded even the most optimistic assessments. Between April 1993 and December 1994, dozens of analysts from MI6, CIA, and Allied intelligence services worked in rotating shifts at the secure facility, systematically processing Mitrokhin's handwritten notes. The archive documented the identities of hundreds of KGB agents and assets who had operated in Western countries during the Cold War. Some were retired or deceased, but many were still active in government, academia, journalism, or other influential positions. The notes documented recruitment methods, the type of information these individuals had provided, their motivations for collaboration with Soviet intelligence, and in many cases their current status and location. For the British intelligence community, the archive was transformative. It provided answers to questions that had puzzled Western intelligence for decades. It explained how the Soviets had obtained certain classified information. It revealed the existence of agents whose activities had been suspected but never proven. It exposed influence operations and active measures that had shaped political developments in numerous countries. The geopolitical context of 1992 and 1993 was crucial to understanding the significance of the archive. The Soviet Union had dissolved in December 1991, ending the Cold War and creating a period of dramatic transformation in international relations. Russia, under President Boris Yeltsin, was attempting to transition from communist authoritarianism to democratic governance and market economics. The KGB had been formally disbanded and replaced by new intelligence services, though many of the personnel and institutional cultures remained largely unchanged. In this environment, the Mitrokhin Archive represented both a historical record of Cold War intelligence operations and a guide to ongoing security concerns. Many of the agents identified in the archive were still alive and active. Some held positions in the new Russian government or in Western institutions where they could continue to provide intelligence or influence to Russian services. British intelligence began a systematic process of exploitation. The archive was divided into regional sections covering Western Europe, North America, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Teams of analysts worked through the notes, cross-referencing them with existing intelligence holdings, identifying individuals who required investigation, and developing operational plans for approaching or neutralizing compromised assets. One of the first challenges was determining what to do with information about agents in allied countries. The archive contained extensive information about KGB operations in the United States, Canada, Australia, and other nations with close intelligence relationships with the United Kingdom. British intelligence had an obligation to share information about compromised individuals in these countries, but doing so required careful coordination to protect the source, Mitrokhin, and to manage the diplomatic and security implications. Beginning in mid-1993 and continuing through 1995, RI6 began sharing selected information from the Mitrokhin Archive with liaison intelligence services. The CIA received extensive information about Soviet operations in the United States, including penetrations of government agencies, universities, and defense contractors. Canadian intelligence received information about operations in Canada. Australian, French, German, Italian, and other allied services received information relevant to their countries. In each case, the British carefully controlled what information was shared, how it was presented, and what could be done with it to protect the source and maintain control over the exploitation of the archive. The archive documented KGB penetration of Western institutions that had been far more extensive than most officials had realized. Operations in the United Kingdom, France, West Germany, Italy, and other countries had successfully recruited government officials, journalists, labor union leaders, academics, and others who provided intelligence or served Soviet interests. The files showed how the KGB had worked to influence elections, to amplify anti-American sentiment, to weaken NATO cohesion, and to support communist parties and leftist movements across Europe, the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. As Western intelligence services worked through the archive, they faced difficult questions about what to do with the information. In many cases, the individuals identified as KGB agents or assets were now elderly, retired, or living in countries where prosecution would be complicated by legal and diplomatic considerations. Some had been recruited under coercion or blackmail and might be considered as much victims as perpetrators. Others had provided relatively minor information and had long since ended their relationship with Soviet intelligence. The decision-making about whether to prosecute, investigate, or simply monitor these individuals varied by country and by the specific circumstances of each case. In some instances, particularly where the agent had provided highly sensitive information or where there was evidence of ongoing contact with Russian intelligence, prosecutions were pursued. In other cases, the individuals were quietly approached and debriefed, sometimes cooperating with Western intelligence in exchange for immunity from prosecution. One of the most publicized cases resulting from the Mitrokhin Archive was that of Melita Norwood, a British civil servant who had provided atomic weapons information to the KGB during the 1940s and had continued to pass classified information for decades afterward. Norwood had worked at the British Non-Ferrous Metals Research Association, which was involved in atomic weapons research during World War II and the early Cold War. The archive documented that she had been recruited by the KGB in the late 1930s and had provided information about British atomic weapons development that had significantly aided the Soviet nuclear program. When her identity was publicly revealed in 1999, 7 years after Mitrokhin's defection, Norwood was 87 years old, living quietly in retirement in suburban London. Journalists descended on her modest home in Bexley Heath, where she acknowledged her espionage but expressed no remorse, stating that she had acted out of conviction that the Soviet Union deserved to have atomic weapons to balance Western power. British authorities decided not to prosecute her, citing her age and health, though the revelation generated significant public controversy about whether justice demanded prosecution regardless of age or whether an elderly woman posed no current threat and prosecution would serve no purpose. The decision not to prosecute Norwood and others like her reflected broader questions about the purpose of pursuing cases based on the Mitrokhin Archive. Different countries answered these questions differently depending on their legal systems, their political cultures, and their current intelligence priorities. For Mitrokhin himself, the years following his defection were characterized by a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. He had successfully delivered his archive to Western intelligence and had contributed to a comprehensive understanding of Soviet intelligence operations. However, he remained largely anonymous, living under British protection with a new identity, unable to publicly claim credit for his work or to see the full impact of what he had accomplished. British intelligence imposed strict secrecy on Mitrokhin's identity and location. He lived in a secure location in the United Kingdom under MOM E6 protection, receiving a pension and support from the British government. His wife was brought to the UK to join him in the years following his defection, though the reunion was complicated by years of deception and the circumstances of their exile. Their children remained in Russia, where they faced questioning by Russian security services about their father's activities and whereabouts. The Russian government's response to news of Mitrokhin's defection, which became known to Russian intelligence in 1993, was one of fury and embarrassment. The defection represented an enormous intelligence failure. Mitrokhin had worked in the KGB Archive for 12 years, had removed comprehensive notes documenting Soviet operations, and had successfully exfiltrated this material without being detected. The security implications were staggering. Hundreds of operations were potentially compromised, and the damage assessment would take years to complete. Russian authorities launched an investigation into how Mitrokhin had been able to conduct his note-taking and removal activities for so long without detection. The investigation resulted in major reforms to Russian intelligence security practices, though these came too late to prevent the damage Mitrokhin had caused. Russian security services also attempted to minimize the significance of the archive and to cast doubt on its authenticity. Official Russian statements claimed that Mitrokhin was a low-level archivist who had access only to old and irrelevant files, that many of his notes were fabrications or exaggerations, and that Western intelligence services were exploiting the archive for propaganda purposes rather than legitimate security concerns. Western intelligence professionals who had seen the archive's contents and could verify its accuracy against other sources dismissed these claims. In 1999, 7 years after his defection, the existence of the Mitrokhin Archive was made public, with the publication of a book titled The Sword and the Shield, the Mitrokhin Archive and the Secret History of the KGB, written by Christopher Andrew, an official historian, given access to the archive by MI6 in collaboration with Mitrokhin himself. The book's publication was authorized by British intelligence after careful review to ensure that nothing in it would compromise ongoing operations or endanger living sources. The book provided the first comprehensive public account of the archive's contents, revealing the scope of Soviet intelligence operations during the Cold War and identifying numerous agents and operations that had previously been unknown. The publication generated enormous public interest and media coverage. It also generated controversy, particularly in countries where individuals named in the archive were still alive and denied the allegations against them. Subsequent volumes based on the Mitrokhin Archive were published covering operations in specific regions. The Mitrokhin Archive, 2. The KGB and the World focused on operations outside Europe and North America, documenting Soviet intelligence activities in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. These publications provided historians, journalists, and intelligence professionals with an unprecedented resource for understanding Cold War espionage. The impact of the archive on historical understanding of the Cold War has been profound. Prior to Mitrokhin's defection, knowledge of Soviet intelligence operations was fragmentary, based on limited information from previous defectors, intercepted communications, and Western intelligence investigations. The Mitrokhin Archive provided a comprehensive view that allowed historians to see patterns, to understand the scale and scope of Soviet operations, and to appreciate the extent to which intelligence activities shaped Cold War dynamics. For intelligence professionals, the archive became a teaching tool. It documented recruitment methods, operational tradecraft, communication protocols, and organizational structures that provided valuable insights into how hostile intelligence services operated. Training programs for Western intelligence officers incorporated case studies from the Mitrokhin Archive to illustrate both successful Soviet operations and the vulnerabilities that had allowed those operations to succeed. Mitrokhin himself remained largely out of public view even after the publication of the books based on his archive. He gave few interviews and maintained his protected status under British intelligence. His relationship with his children remained strained throughout the final years of his life. Both faced investigation and social stigma in Russia as the children of a traitor. When they eventually learned the full extent of what their father had done, they expressed feelings of betrayal, not about his actions against the Soviet state, which had by then collapsed, but about the deception he had maintained within the family and the consequences his choices had imposed on them. His wife struggled to reconcile decades of marriage with the revelation that her husband had maintained an enormous secret throughout their life together, a secret that had uprooted her from her homeland, separated her from her children, and placed her in permanent exile. According to limited accounts from people who knew them in exile, their relationship was marked by tension and periods of estrangement, though they remained together until Mitrokhin's death. The question of Mitrokhin's motivations is complex. Unlike many defectors who were motivated primarily by money, ideological conversion, or personal grievances, Mitrokhin appeared to be driven by a combination of moral conviction, historical consciousness, and a sense of duty to document what he believed were crimes committed by the Soviet state. He had not sought wealth. The British provided him with a pension and support, but nothing approaching the financial rewards some other defectors had received. He had not sought fame. He had lived anonymously for years and seemed uncomfortable with public attention when it came. His commitment to his documentation project over 12 years, despite enormous personal risk and with no guarantee that he would ever successfully defect or that his work would have any impact, suggests a personality characterized by remarkable patience, self-control, and conviction. When asked in rare interviews about his motivations, he emphasized that he had felt compelled to create a record of what he viewed as historical crimes, even if that record might never be seen by anyone. The act of documentation itself had moral value to him. independent of whether it ever had practical consequences. The psychological burden of maintaining this secret for more than a decade, of working daily in the institution he was secretly documenting, of hiding his activities from his wife and family, and of living with the constant fear of discovery, would have broken most people. Mitrokhin sustained it through what appears to have been a deeply held belief that what he was doing mattered, and that historical truth was worth the risk. Vasili Mitrokhin died on January 23, 2004, at the age of 81, in a secure location in the United Kingdom. The cause of death was not publicly disclosed, though he had been in declining health for several years. His death was not announced publicly until several months later, and even then, few details were provided about his final years or the circumstances of his death. His obituaries, when they eventually appeared in British and international media, focused on his contribution to Cold War history and his role in exposing Soviet intelligence operations. They described him as a meticulous archivist who had risked everything to document what he believed were historical crimes, and who had provided Western intelligence with the most comprehensive archive of Soviet operations ever obtained. The Mitrokhin Archive continues to be studied and analyzed more than 3 decades after his defection. New insights emerge periodically as researchers discover connections or implications that were not initially apparent. The archive has informed dozens of books, hundreds of academic papers, and countless intelligence assessments. It has shaped understanding of Cold War history and continues to provide lessons for contemporary intelligence and security professionals. The question of what the archive actually accomplished in terms of concrete security outcomes remains difficult to answer definitively. Some operations were disrupted, some agents were identified and neutralized, some security practices were reformed, but the broader impact may have been more in the realm of understanding and awareness than in specific operational consequences. The archive confirmed that Soviet intelligence penetration had been far more extensive than most Western officials had realized, and that assessment has influenced security policies and counterintelligence practices in the decades since. For the families of agents exposed by the archive, the impact was immediate and often devastating. Individuals who had kept secrets for decades suddenly found themselves under investigation. Families who had believed one thing about their relatives discovered painful truths. Children learned that parents had lived double lives. Spouses learned that their partners had deceived them for years. The ripple effects of these revelations extended through multiple generations. Mitrokhin's own family bore costs they had not chosen and could not have prevented. His wife spent her final years in exile from everything familiar, living with a man whose lifelong deception had fundamentally altered her understanding of their marriage. His children grew up believing in a father who turned out to have been someone quite different, and then spent their adult lives dealing with the consequences of choices he had made without their knowledge or consent. The ethical complexity of the Mitrokhin case resists simple resolution. He violated professional obligations and betrayed colleagues who trusted him. He deceived his wife for decades about activities that would upend her life. He made choices that would harm his children. Yet he also documented genuine crimes committed by an oppressive state, preserved historical evidence that might otherwise have been destroyed, and provided information that Western democracies used to protect themselves against hostile intelligence operations. Whether his actions were justified depends on how one weighs competing moral claims: loyalty to state versus loyalty to conscience, professional duty versus historical truth, protection of family versus documentation of crimes. Different people reach different conclusions depending on their values and their understanding of what obligations matter most when they conflict. What seems undeniable is that Mitrokhin understood the human cost of what he was doing and chose to proceed anyway, believing that some things mattered more than personal happiness or family harmony. Whether that belief was correct, whether the archive justified the sacrifice, whether 12 years of secret documentation and a life spent in exile accomplished enough to balance what was lost. These are questions without objective answers. Vasili Mitrokhin was 50 years old when he began copying KGB secrets beneath the nose of Soviet intelligence. He was 70 when he walked into the British embassy in Riga, carrying nothing but a briefcase and a claim that seemed too large to believe. He was 81 when he died in British protection, having lived to see his archive reshape understanding of the Cold War while destroying his relationship with his children. And in between, he lost his country, his identity, and any certainty about whether the truth he had spent 12 years documenting had been worth the cost of everything he had sacrificed to preserve it.